Anyway, take a look at these articles that I just sent you. Also, take a look at the redchippoker.com fold equity calculator, because this will help you with fold equity quite a bit and dealing with these guys that get a little bit more sticky. So I want to show you how this works so you can experiment with it this afternoon, because it'll help you a ton. And this is another thing that you for sure need to add to your bookmarks. So like that should be right up there. Like when I pull up my bookmarks, and I've got like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, whatever, I also have this right next to it. So let me show you how this works here. So this is what I was talking about, right? Like if the pot is $100 and we decide to move all in, this number is irrelevant. So how much do you have to call? We decide to move all in for $50 and we have no chance of winning at showdown. Our opponent needs to fold 33% of the time, right? If we decide to move all in for $100 into a $100 pot, our opponent needs to fold 50% of the time, right? So this is a great way to just constantly double check that you're doing the math right in your head, and it'll clarify river situations for you quite a bit. Another thing is that if you're on an earlier street on the turn or on the flop and you have equity, let's say you're semi-bluffing, this will also adjust for that. Does that make sense?
Can you show me an example?
Yeah, so this is where Poker Cruncher ties in very closely, and after you watch the training video, everything will come together. I know it probably seems like I'm rambling right now, but this is like one of the best examples I can give you. So let's say that you, it pulls around you on the button and you open 9-8 of hearts. Okay? And you don't know this, but your opponent calls you with king, queen of diamonds. Okay? And the flop comes queen of spades, 7 of hearts, deuce of clubs. Okay? So to most people, this seems like just a really standard flop, right? They're not noticing much, but what they're failing to miss is that you flopped a backdoor straight flush draw. Okay? And that is huge. Like that's so much more powerful than most people realize. So when you have a suited connector,
backdoor straight draw.
What's that?
And a backdoor straight draw.
Yeah, so you have a backdoor straight flush draw. So when you have a suited connector and one of the cards on the flop ends up giving you a 3-card straight flush, this card is called a pin card, PIN card. Okay. PLO players will refer to it as that as well. And what that means is that you've got a backdoor flush draw, right? So you're going the turn and river is going to go heart 4.2% of the time. Okay? 4.2% of the time is equivalent to having one extra out in your hand. So you know that formula where you count your outs and you multiply by 4. It's called the rule of 4 to figure out how often you're going to improve to the best hand. So like you have a flush draw, you go, oh, okay, I have 9 outs. 9 times 4 is 36, right? The reason you multiply it by 4 is because each out is worth a little bit more than 4%. Okay. So if you know a backdoor flush draw is worth 4.2% equity, that's the equivalent to having an extra out in your hand. Okay. Now backdoor straight draws, right? If you have a 3-card straight in your hand, you're going to improve to a straight by the river 4.4% of the time. So that's also equivalent to having another out in your hand. The turn and river are going to go Jack 10, 10, 6, or 6-5. 4.4% of the time. Okay, so combined, you're going to improve to either a straight or a flush about 9% of the time, and then you're even against the hand as strong as top pair of king, queen of diamonds. You could also improve by backdooring trips with 9, 9, 8, 8, or you could also backdoor 2 pair with 9, 8. So in total, you have 10.4% equity on this board. And you can just fact check that by clicking calculate, and having Poker Cruncher deal to the river, and it will show you how much equity you have. You have 10.4% equity versus your opponent's range. Okay? So what you do is you take that amount of equity that you have versus one of the, I like to run worst case scenarios. This is just like real estate. I'm I'm making sure that I have that cash flow, $100 a door or whatever.
Worst case scenario.
Worst case scenario. So put yourself up against top pair, right? Because you're not going to be up against top pair that often. It's very rare in the grand scheme of things. But run it as a worst case scenario where you're up against top pair and your 9 and your 8 aren't good. Those outs aren't good, right? And you have 10.4% equity. Did you see the way I calculated that or no?
You hit the calculate button.
Yeah. I mean, I clicked the wrong button and now it's saying fold. But anyway, what you do is you take that percentage. So let's say that you're on the flop, right? And you're playing 2-5. And after raising pre-flop, the pot is $30, right? And you decide that on this board, this is a dry board, your opponent checks to you, you don't know that he has king queen, you want to c-bet half the pot. So you decide to c-bet $15. If you had no chance of winning, your opponent would need to fold a third of his range for you to break even. Okay? This is why this calculator is so great. So your opponent would need to fold a third of the time for you to break even if you c-bet. Okay, and he's for sure folding that often on a board this dry, right? But it gets better. So now I'll give my Billy Mays speech, buy now and we'll send you the second one free. You add 10% equity to the estimated percentage of equity when called, right? So if you get called, you assume that you're going to win roughly 10% of the time. That's worst case scenario. Do you see what that does to this number? It drops that number, right?
Yeah.
So now, because you have all these backdoor outs and you're c-betting half of the pot, your opponent only needs to fold 23% of the time for you to break even. Because you're going to end up backdooring one of those hands 10% of the time. And then the other thing that this calculator doesn't factor in is that if you backdoor a flush or you backdoor a straight versus top pair, you're getting paid on the river. The reverse implied odds are on your opponent's shoulders. It's very dangerous to play out of position when you're against somebody that knows how to utilize a strategy where he's betting with his backdoor draws, right? So not only can you c-bet and win, you're also setting up turn barrels and river barrels, and you have an opportunity to improve to the best hand. Even better, when you improve to the best hand, you're probably going to get paid. So this number might actually be a negative number. Your opponent might not need to fold at all for this to be long-term profitable, especially if stacks are deep. So that's something that is really like a mind-blowing thing to most people, right? Like this guy can be check calling 77% of the time, and you would still break even on this flop. Okay? So do you see why it makes sense for you to keep betting and for your opponent to be sticky? It's because this is just how the math of poker works. If you bet, keep betting. If you call, keep calling, right? Now, let's make this situation even better. Let's say that you bet with 9-8 of hearts, your opponent calls, and you pick up one of those Yahtzee cards. You pick up the 6 of hearts. Okay, so now you picked up a straight flush draw. Click calculate. Oh, come on. Let me try this again. Got the Queen of Spades, 7 of Hearts, Deuce of Clubs, and we'll give you the 6 of Hearts. So you picked up a straight flush draw.
Mm-hmm.
You have Poker Cruncher deal to the river, click calculate. You're going to improve to the best hand 34% of the time. So now put this into the red chip fold equity calculator. The pot is now $60 after you bet the flop. You want to bet half the pot on the turn. That's $30. And let's say if your estimated equity was 0, you'd need your opponent to fold a third of the time. Now, because you picked up 34% equity, your opponent never needs to fold for this to be profitable. It's negative 22%, meaning that even if your opponent never folds, this is going to be long-term profitable.
Still a profitable bet.
Right, and the reason for that is very simple. It's that
unless you think he's going to check raise.
Right, which is happening much less often than you would think.
Yeah,
Um,
especially if he check calls the flop, that's not really a card that he can check raise the turn.
exactly. People are so afraid, like they pick up a big draw like this and they check back and they go, oh man, I don't want to get check raised. It's going to happen like maybe 5% of the time. The rest of the time, you're just putting a tremendous amount of pressure on your opponent.
Hmm.
He's not always going to have king queen. A lot of times, he's going to have ace seven that he's trying to hang on with, and you're putting a tremendous amount of pressure on him when he never needs to fold for this to be a profitable
Or
bet.
he has tens or something like, and then how do you decide if you brick the river whether or not it's right to bluff?
Oh, so yeah, I'll show that to you as well. But let me finish up on this turn thing here. So. The reason why your opponent never needs you to fold is because when you bet half of the pot, you're you're really only risking a third of all of the chips in the pot. So like if you bet $30 into 60, the total pot is now $90, right? You're only risking one third of the total pot, right?
Hmm.
And you have more than one third of the total pot worth of equity. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So if you have 34% equity when you only need to have 33% to break even, this number is negative, meaning that your opponent never needs to fold. So then you can work backward in Poker Cruncher to see like how extreme this really is. So let's say instead of having a heart, this is like the six of diamonds, right? So now you just have an open ender. Click calculate. You have 18% equity instead. So it dropped significantly. Punch this in here and see how often your opponent needs to fold. He only needs to fold 12% of the time for you to break even, right? Every single person that you're playing against is folding this turn 12% of the time, right? Now, forget both of these hands. If you just
More than 12%, right?
what's that?
They're folding more than 12% of the time.
Yeah, every single person that you're playing against is folding more than 12% of the time, meaning that your bet is always profitable. So,
Yeah.
and now look at this from like an aerial view. Let's say that you walk up to a 2-5 table and this hand is playing out, right? The guy in position bets the flop. The guy out of position calls. Then the six of diamonds comes off. It looks like a complete blank to everyone at the table and everyone observing the game. It looks like a complete blank turn card, right? But it actually changed the action significantly. And it benefited your range significantly. And it allows you to continue barreling, and your opponent only needs to fold a very small percentage of the time for you to break even. Now let's make it even more extreme. Let's say that you only pick up a gut shot. You pick up like the five of spades. Quick calculate, okay? You picked up 9% equity there with implied odds too. So you have 9% equity. Your opponent only needs to fold 24% of the time. If he folds 1 in 4 times, you're breaking even. And the other thing is that if you drill a 6 on the river, you're getting paid for sure, right? So there are implied odds as well. This number might actually be 0. Okay? So are you learning a bit here?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so now the last thing is that, like, let's say that everything bricks out, and this is just like a dismal river for you, right? Now everything is static. It just goes back to those ratios, right? This number is always 0. You have no equity if you get called, right? So the pot is $120, and you have two options. You can either bet $60 or you can check. You know that if you bet $60, your opponent needs to fold a third of the time for you to break even.
Or you can shove all in.
Well, you could, but I'm just giving you two examples for now, right?
Oh, okay.
You could. I mean, we'll definitely get to that as well. But now you need to decide, like, how do you pick the hands you want to bluff with, right? Because you don't have any equity anymore, right? So if you're on the flop, you just pick all the hands that have the most equity and bet with them, right? You bet with your flush draws, you bet with your straight draws, you bet with your open enders, your gut shots, and especially if they have two overcards. And then on dry boards, you take all the hands that have backdoor flush draws and fire with them, right? Then on the turn, if you have equity or you pick up equity, you keep betting. So that's how you choose the hands to barrel with. You choose the hands that have the most equity and the most implied odds for you. But once you get to the river, that's no longer a factor because you either have a hand that you're value betting with or you have no chance of winning a showdown. It's one of the two. It's polarized. So when you get to a river situation, the best thing to do is ask yourself, which hands in your range have the best blockers, right? And on this board, the best hand to fire the river with would be Jack 10. You want to guess why that is? I'll just let you kind of think outside the box here for a second. I know this is totally new to you.
Because he's gonna probably call you with a queen, and so hands that he can fold are jacks, tens, and if you have Jack 10, you're blocking jacks and tens.
Right. Yeah. You're on the right.
Right?
You're on the right track. So you raise the button, and your opponent calls out of the big blind, right? When he calls out of the big blind, you know that he doesn't have aces, kings, queens, ace, king, and he usually doesn't have ace, queen if you're playing against a good player, right? So that's kind of making it a lot more likely that the hand that he's calling you with is either queen jack or queen 10. Okay? So when you have a jack in your hand, it makes it 25% less likely that your opponent has queen jack. And it also makes it 25% less. If you have a 10, it makes it 25% less likely that your opponent has queen 10. You see how that works? So you're significantly decreasing the likelihood of your opponent having top pair, and you're making it a lot more likely that he has a 7 in his hand or one of those middling pairs like 9s or 8s because you have 2 blockers in your hand. Okay? So you see how that works? When you get to river situations, ask yourself, what are the 2 or 3 best hands that have blockers in them? And it's usually going to be something like Jack 10 on this board, 10 9, or maybe a hand like King Jack, because King Jack would block King Queen and Queen Jack. You see how that works? So you're just trying to decrease the likelihood that your opponent has top pair, and that increases the likelihood of him folding. And you might be able to meet this threshold, this 33% threshold. So, and again, like keep in mind, you can fire, you can fire $60 on this river and fail twice as long as you're right the third time, and you would still break even after all of that. So, what does that mean? It means like if you're never getting snapped off on the river, you're not bluffing anywhere close to the optimal frequency. So basically, what we learned today is that like if you have equity on the flop, fire. If you have equity on the turn, fire. And if you have blockers on the river, fire. That's pretty much my spiel as far as
those are the only times to fire the flop. Like, what if you have no equity on the flop? Sometimes it's right to fire.
Well, okay, so now this is where you can really go crazy with Poker Cruncher if you want to. You could, let's say, I'll just put together like a makeshift range of hands real quick for the big blind, right? So let's just construct like a random defense range for him. You know, like most guys are defending way too wide. So I'll just go in here and add like all these suited connectors and stuff and suited aces, and everybody you're playing against is defending way too wide out of the big blind. Okay, and you'll learn something real quick here. So
they're probably they're probably defending even like ace 2 solve.
Right. Yeah. I mean, they're defending such a crazy wide range of hands that it's difficult for me to even define. You know, it might look something like this. But I need to like carve out some of these hands. Like I'll give people credit for 3-betting with these hands out of the big blind, I guess.
Yeah.
But most people are defending with just an absurd range of hands like this. Okay. So now give me a dry board. Just pick a dry board off the top of your head.
Jack, 6, deuce, rainbow.
Okay. So Jack of spades, 6 of hearts, deuce of clubs. Okay. This is where Poker Cruncher is just pure gold. You can go in here, and so there are tabs right here. Click this tab and tell it to only deal to the flop. Okay? So you're telling Poker Cruncher only deal to the flop. We don't care what happens on the turn of the river. Okay? And now click calculate. And what this does is let it do roughly 3 million simulations in Monte Carlo style. And then what this does is it calculates the equity of this range of hands versus a random hand. Okay. It also takes this entire range and it breaks it down in this center column and shows you how likely it is for your opponent to flop one of these categories: flush draw, open-ended straight draw, inside straight draw, high card, one pair, two pair, three of a kind. You see how that works? So it's breaking down
With this flop, it shows you.
Right. So
flop, it shows you how likely it is for them to flop those hands.
All Poker Cruncher is doing is taking this range and showing you how likely it is for this range to connect with this board, and it displays all of it right here in the center column. Okay.
Sure.
So there are a ton of numbers here and a whole bunch of confusing stuff going on, and you know, it'll make your head spin if you don't know what you're looking for. But really, all you're looking for is this number right here, is the high card number, and you can move your cursor over the top of it. You see this on the screen, right? I hope.
Yeah.
So you move it over this box, and it will highlight all this stuff in red, right? What is this red stuff? It's the stuff that your opponent is going to check fold on this flop. Okay?
Because it's just a high card.
Right. So let's say that you have two napkins. There's absolutely no chance of you winning at showdown, right? If you bet half of the pot, you need your opponent to fold 33% of the time to break even, and he's check folding 66% of the time on this flop.
Some guys are. Some guys are floating out of position with king, queen suited.
Right. So now, I mean, let's get crazy aggressive here. Let's get really out of control and say that we'll just remove all of the aces from your opponent's range. Okay. And assume that he's going to check call with 100% of his ace high range, right? Now we'll just go in here and calculate again. This won't be exact, but it'll be close enough. He's still folding over 60% of the time. You know? Like, that's pretty absurd, isn't it? So if he's check calling with any pair, any ace high, he's still check folding over 60% of the time. Mm-hmm. So what does that mean? It means like you can fire away with any two cards on this flop and be long-term profitable, and the only way your opponent can prevent you from doing that is if he's calling with every pair, every ace high, and any two cards that have a backdoor flush draw. That's the only way he could stop you from being long-term profitable, by c-betting with any two cards. So on dry boards...
So that's like where... So real quick, you said on river or on flop, bet if you have equity on the flop fire, equity on the turn fire, blockers on river fire. So if I open the button with pocket threes here, I should be c-betting this flop because it's going to be tough for me to win at showdown.
Yeah, I mean, threes, they have some showdown value. So, you know,
I'm trying to think of a hand that I would raise with and not have like much equity with on that flop. And it should be right to c-bet. I
usually like to slow down with the small pairs. If I flop a hand like 6-5, I'm probably going to check behind, and then if I have like a strong ace high, I'll probably check, because what you'll find is that like if you start c-betting too much, if you're c-betting with pocket threes on this board, you're c-betting about 90% of the time on this board, and like people are going to get fed up with that and start check calling really liberally, or they're going to start check raising you too much. What you're shooting for is about a 70% c-betting frequency, and in order to achieve that, you need to occasionally check back with some pairs and some ace high. Okay. So hands that we're looking to fire with would be like king queen, because we've got two overcards to a jack. We've got a backdoor straight draw.
I was thinking. I was going to say king queen, but then I was thinking to myself, I was trying to find an example where it was right to bet without equity on the flop, and I'm like, well, even with king queen, I have equity.
Right, or even with a hand like 9-8, you still have backdoor straight draw outs, and if you had like 9-8 of hearts, I mean, then you're gold. You know, you've got like that 10% backdoor equity. You should just blast away.
I guess I need to realize that, like, you know, I have a lot more equity than what I think. Even
way more equity, right? Like, and you
plus,
know,
if you count the implied odds on top of
that queen 7 deuce board that I gave you was pretty extreme, actually, because you're not always going to be up against king queen. Like, sometimes people will be calling you with middle pair, and your 9 and your 8 will also be good. And at that point, you're winning 35% of the time. You're going to improve to the best hand 35% of the time. Your opponent never needs to fold for your bet to be profitable. So really the only time that you need to slow down is on these very bogged down boards where it's like one of these boards, you know. Stay away from like going crazy with these boards, obviously. And then also like those the
ace high boards.
like the monotone boards with two broadways in them, like these boards are really hard to win on. So like if you have the ace of spades, empty the clip here, and and take your big draws and fire away with them. But this would be one of the boards where your c betting frequency would go from 70% to probably 50%. It would drop a little bit because it's much easier for your opponent to defend. So, but on those dry boards, go ahead, go crazy, and nobody that you're playing against right now is going to slow down and try and stop you, especially in live cash. So that wraps everything up that I've got to say today. So basically, make sure you bookmark this in your browser. Take a look at minimum defense frequency so you know how to defend against really aggressive players. Just kind of go in there and read those forums. It doesn't matter if you understand it. Just make sure you're familiar with the forums. And then also go in here and watch that Poker Cruncher tutorial. And that's all. Okay. That's all I've got for you today.